All she's done is disappoint me. The words landed like a hammer on polished wood, sharp enough that every head in the hall turned. Dad's voice carried, not because he shouted, but because he knew how to project years of command training hadn't left him. He stood tall, chest out, the kind of man who could silence a room without ever raising his volume. And in that moment, he used that power, not for discipline, not for pride, but for humiliation. My humiliation. The reunion was supposed to be simple. Just family, neighbors, old friends gathered in the town's community hall, the kind of place where bingo nights and fish fries filled calendars. Folding chairs creaked under the weight of aging veterans in pressed khakis. Women fanned themselves against the late summer heat, and kids scurried around with paper cups of lemonade. It wasn't fancy, but it carried the smell of homewood polish fried chicken, the faint tang of brass polish still clinging to the veterans' medals. I had walked in with my head high, not expecting a parade, but at least civility. It had been years since I'd stood in a room with my father, years since he'd acknowledged my existence beyond a clipped, dismissive line. Yet here we were, sharing the same oxygen again. He spotted me the moment I entered. His eyes narrowed, lips pressed into a thin line. If I had been a stranger, I might have thought he was about to deliver a speech. Instead, he waited until the chatter died down, naturally, then dropped the words like a grenade in the middle of the room. All she's done is disappoint me. The silence that followed was louder than applause. It roared in my ears, burned my cheeks. I kept my face steady, but inside every muscle in me screamed to move, to shout back, to do anything but stand there like a school kid called to the principal's office. Then, as if that blow weren't enough, he turned. One large weathered hand clapped onto the shoulder of a man standing nearby. Younger than him, older than me, broad shoulders, clean-cut hair, the kind of bearing you recognized instantly. "This," Dad said, proudly, voice booming. "Now this is a man who knows what service means, an elite member of the Navy SEALs." The hall murmured, impressed. Heads nodded, eyes darted toward the stranger. Respect practically radiated from the crowd, directed away from me toward the man Dad had chosen to elevate. My father's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile, more a smirk of vindication, as if he'd proven a point without needing to say it aloud. This is what I wanted, not her. I should have looked away, should have swallowed the sting and let the moment pass, but I didn't. I couldn't. The SEAL turned, eyes landing on me. For a second, his expression held the same easy confidence he'd worn when Dad introduced him. Then it shifted. The color drained from his face. His mouth parted just slightly enough that I saw the tremble in his jaw. He froze. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, trembling yet clear enough for every ear nearby to catch, he said, "Are you the Black Widow of the SEALs?" The words cut through the hall like a blade. Murmurs spread. A veteran in the back stiffened. A younger man swallowed hard, as if the title alone carried weight. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The name hung there heavy, undeniable. For a heartbeat, even my father faltered. His smirk slipped, confusion flickering behind his eyes. He didn't know what the SEAL knew. He didn't understand the stories whispered in barracks, in briefing rooms, on tarmacs before missions. He had spent years calling me a disappointment. Blind to the reputation I had built, the life I had carved with blood and grit, far from his gaze. That was the moment the room began to tilt. Not in my favor just yet, but away from him. Away from his authority, his certainty. But before I take you deeper into that scene, before I tell you why a man trained in the harshest corners of the military would tremble at the sight of me, I need to take you back. Because the truth is, that moment didn't start in that hall. It started years before, in a house where discipline was stricter than love, where silence was louder than praise, where every path I chose seemed like betrayal in his eyes. I was raised under the shadow of a man who had worn medals like armor and who believed his legacy would live only through a son. But he didn't have one. He had me. And in his mind, that was his first disappointment. The rest, at least according to him, was inevitable. The first lesson my father taught me wasn't how to throw a ball. It was how to stand at attention. He set my heels together on the kitchen linoleum, pushed my shoulders back, and told me not to blink. "A straight back tells the world you won't break," he said. I was 8. The clock over the stove ticked. The house smelled like black coffee and shoe polish. That was our family fragrance. He was retired by then, but retirement didn't soften him. It gave him more hours to perfect control. Morning runs at 05:30 shirts ironed to knife edges. Yes, sir, and no, sir, spoken like breath. Our small town adored him. Parade speeches at the high school, a folding chair with his name at the Veterans Hall. People called him sir at the grocery store. I called him dad and felt like I was borrowing a rank I hadn't earned. He believed legacies pass through sons. My mother believed in other inheritances, quiet books, mercy. At home, she tucked poems into my lunch bag, Frost Hughes Dickinson, like talismans. She never argued with my father. She waited out weather. Some storms answer only to time, she'd say. At 12, he took me to an Army-Navy game. The stadium breathed steam, brass bands, clanged, cadets in long coats marched like chess pieces. When Navy scored, I cheered. He didn't look at me. "Leave those colors to men who can pull their weight," he said, eyes on the field. I pretended I'd misheard. Pretending became practice. At home, there was the altar, a glass case with medals spaced just so dusted every Saturday with a brush in a velvet pouch. My job was the uniforms. He taught me the iron's weight, the angle of the press, the snap when a crease is right. Precision is respect, he'd say. I learned the regulations like other kids learned pop songs. I could identify every ribbon by color before long division. At 15, I told him I wanted to apply to the Naval Academy. He went so still I could hear the refrigerator humming. "You want attention?" he said, not looking up from the mail. "Not service." I told him I wanted both. He set the letters down, one by one, like bricks between us. "You don't have the Constitution." He didn't mean my stamina. He meant my sex. The house got quiet after that. Silence was his discipline. Dinner at 1800 dishes, stacked to the left of the sink. News at 7, lights out at 10. When I aced chemistry, he said, When I won a track meet, he said, "Don't get sloppy with your form." Saturday mornings, he inspected my room. The bed had to be drum tight. The shoes had to sit at a 45. Once he found a dust mote on the sill and handed me the cloth. My mother did her persuading in the margins. She drove me to a recruiter's office the first time, parking 2 blocks away so the car wouldn't be seen from Main Street. While I filled out forms, she graded papers in the front seat. When I came back with pamphlets, she didn't ask what he'd say. She asked what I wanted most. "A fair fight," I said. She tapped the wheel. "Then train for unfair weather." Senior year. I mailed the application without telling him. I wrote my essay at the kitchen table. After midnight, the house a museum of breathing. I described cadence at dawn, how order can open space inside someone told she's too much. When the thin envelope came first, we acknowledged receipt. I hid it in a book. When the thick one arrived in March, I pressed it to my chest until the cold sank through the paper. I waited until he was in his study. I knocked and stepped in. He looked up, jaw set. I held out the envelope. "Sir?" I said. He slid it with a letter opener and read the first line. "We are pleased to offer." He stopped, folded. The paper, slid it back. "So you're serious about this?" he said. Not a question. I nodded. He turned to his ledger. "We'll discuss it later." We didn't. Graduation night. He didn't come to the backyard party my mother strung with white lights and lemonade. Friends asked if I was scared. Yes and no, I said. Yes, about the water. No, about the choice. Around 9, a familiar sedan rolled past and kept going. It felt like being saluted and dismissed at once. The morning I left for plebe summer, my mother tucked 3 envelopes into my duffel. Open when she wrote, "When you're lonely, when you're hurt, when you forget who you are." She hugged me hard at the bus station, then stepped back to inspect me like before school. "Stand up straight," she said, and we both laughed. My father had an appointment to get the tires rotated. On the bus, a boy with a buzz cut asked if I was nervous. "Nerves are a compass," I said. "You just have to read them right." Out the window, the town slid by the hardware store, the diner with lemon pies, the courthouse flag, a little too big for the pole. As the miles thickened and the air leaned toward Salt, I pressed my forehead to the glass and let the cold settle my cheeks. I wasn't running from him. I was running toward the only argument that made sense earn it. Processing smelled like cut grass and chlorine, then salt and gun oil. Hair clippers snapped. Clipboards appeared and vanished. Last name, height, move. That night, I lay on a narrow rack and recited the general orders so I wouldn't count the miles home. I thought about the kitchen linoleum and my father's palms setting my shoulders. He had taught me to stand up straight. He just never imagined I'd do it while facing him. By taps, I had memorized the number stenciled on the bunk above me. I whispered it like a prayer and closed my eyes. I didn't know yet what the teams would demand, what names they'd try to give me, or which ones I'd keep. I only knew this silence had done enough talking. It was my turn. Annapolis didn't love you back. It tested you. The plebe years shaved you down to what would hold under pressure. I learned fast that the trick wasn't to be louder, it was to be exact. On the yard before sunrise, breath-making small fogs in the Chesapeake air, I ran until my chest burned and my legs steadied into metronomes. I learned to fold exhaustion into a pocket and keep moving. The academy gave me what my father had never meant to a way to measure myself without him. I commissioned into the Navy with a face that still looked too young for the uniform I wore, and orders that would park me close to the edges where maps blur. The first time I set foot at Coronado, I felt the Pacific wind push hard enough to check my balance. Sand everywhere, on boots, in teeth under tongue. Men lumbered past with logs on their shoulders, teams moving as one organism, the grinders slick with seawater and sweat. I wasn't there to become a SEAL. That pipeline wasn't open to me, and I wasn't interested in arguing with a door that wouldn't swing. I was there because a task unit needed an operations and intel officer who could think fast, write clearer, and carry weight without advertising it. You don't have to be the loudest person in the room when you're the one quietly deciding which room everyone will kick down. They called me ma'am, at first like a question mark. I learned to answer with schedules, comms plans, logistics that landed on time, and briefs so tight even the chief with the permanent scowl stopped tapping his pen. I ran with them when I could swam cold water because respect likes to see you shiver and stay anyway. Shot until the trigger press felt like thought. I didn't try to be one of them. I learned to be the one they could not afford to ignore. On a training range outside Nyland, the desert heat bleached color out of everything. We ran shoot-house drills under a sun that didn't blink. Again, the instructor barked, and the teams moved with the economy of men who have bled for the right to go second nature. I watched angles watched where eyes went when stress rose, wrote notes in a field book, salt stiff at the seams. In the evenings, I'd sit on a tailgate with a map across my knees while the wind tried to snatch it. A chief named Hill leaned over once, squinting at the way I'd drawn overlapping arcs around a target site. "You like webs?" he said. "Webs catch what runs." I didn't answer. I didn't have to. The first time we went forward, the air smelled like diesel and dust. Night lived in the corners even at noon. We worked out of a borrowed room with a flickering strip light and a table that listed to one side. Radios crackled like old men clearing throats. I learned the music of its static call, signs the tightrope cadence of voices miles from each other, learning to move as if they shared a spine. My job was to build the skeleton roots, timing contingencies that accounted for the human ways plans go sideways. There was a bomb maker burning through lives in a city that forgot its river until it choked on it. We mapped his habits, where he ate, who lit his cigarettes, which door he liked when he needed to vanish. We waited until a Tuesday because the Tuesday vendor took longer to count change. The team kitted up in the dark fingers, quick buckles whispering. I stood with the radio and the feed and the plan spread like an altar on the table. When the first truck stalled 2 blocks earlier than rehearsed, we didn't freeze. We shifted to Route C, called Church, because it passed 3 and slid the timing 5 minutes forward. It should have fallen apart. It didn't. He came out the back as predicted, turned left as predicted, reached for the phone he always used and found its tower sleeping. He hesitated half a breath. That was enough. No shots, no fire. Hands behind his head, then zip ties, then the quiet after. Back at the room, the air stank of adrenaline and old coffee. Hill peeled off gloves and looked at the web I'd drawn. You spun that, he said. And he never saw the silk. The younger ones laughed at the line. Someone drew a spider in the corner of the map with a Sharpie crude legs and a red hourglass that bled through. The joke stuck. The name did too. Black Widow wasn't about body count. It was about what you set and what you sense, how the air changes when the wrong door opens, how a voice on a net goes half a tone up when a plan bumps a wall. After a while, guys who'd never smile in photos started knocking their knuckles twice on my table before stepping out. Superstition, respect, both. Not every night cooperated. Once on the coast where the water wears a different name, but the same taste of salt, the plan tore itself. A truck blew a tire on gravel we'd scouted twice. A light failed on a helmet at the worst corner. A dog we hadn't accounted for found his courage at the wrong second. I heard the shift in a breath. Hold 2, I said. 3 window instead of door. 4. Your pivot now. It sounded calm, because it needed to, not because I was. Later alone, my hands shook so hard I had to sit on them. The men came back with the thing we went to get and all their fingers. I called that a win. The chief called it proof. She hears the web, he told a new kid who still called me ma'am too loudly. She hears it hum. Word traveled the way it does on flights in chow halls over bad coffee in rooms where boots line up at the threshold. I wasn't a legend. I was a rumor that survived inspection. Teams rotated. I rotated with some of them. In Bahrain, the heat felt personal. In the Horn, the wind carried grit that found your molars and set up camp. I learned the sincerity of letters home, written on the back of manifests, the way good men tell jokes before wheels up, because laughter oils the machines that hunger for it. On leave, I went home once and found my father on the porch cleaning a rifle that didn't need it. He asked about the weather. He asked if I'd changed the oil in my car. He didn't ask what I did. I didn't tell him about the night we killed the lights in 3 blocks at once and walked the city like it had been returned to a better moon. I didn't tell him about the kid who slipped me a folded note at a checkpoint that said in careful English, "Please take the loud men away." I didn't tell him I'd cried in a stairwell where the dust hid me and then walked back into a room because crying isn't opposite to courage. It's kin. At Coronado, again between rotations, I rewrote checklists until they fit the way our days actually broke equipment that fails in rain batteries that lie about life. How to count down a man whose eyes are looking somewhere he can't return from. I added a line to every plan, who's watching the watcher. The old guard grumbled until the metrics came clean, fewer injuries, fewer near misses, more nights where the worst thing we brought home was sand. The nickname followed me like a shadow at noon, short, unmistakable. I never used it. Others did. Once a visiting commander shook my hand and said, half smiling, "So you're the spider?" I said I draw maps. He laughed, and make men feel safe inside them. It was the nicest thing anyone in a star ever said to me. There were losses. Some you can explain in reports. Some you fold into a corner of yourself that no one else gets to touch. A good man went quiet one spring and didn't come back from it. I sat with his file until the letters blurred. After I insisted on monthly check-ins that weren't about push-ups, we started asking each other how the air felt inside, not just outside. A chief called it soft. Then he stopped calling it anything after it saved a kid who hadn't yet learned how to say he was drowning. By the time the rumor had a shape, my father had heard none of it. He lived 2 states away and 20 years behind. The town still loved him. The diner still knew his coffee. If someone said my name, he changed the subject to weather or taxes. In rooms far from him, men began to tell stories that started. She was there and ended, and we walked out. I didn't need a parade. I needed my plans to hold. The night a young SEAL would one day recognize me across a crowded hall and lose his breath, he had been the new guy on a 2-vehicle package that should have gone bad, and didn't. Afterward, he'd come up to the table where the radio slept and say, voice low, "Ma'am, did you see that coming?" I said I saw what could. He nodded, like a man who just learned there are different kinds of sight. That's what the teams taught me, that skill and humility can live in the same chest, that you can be invisible and indispensable at once. I learned the art of being where the plan lives and the credit doesn't. Ghost work. Work that leaves a room cleaner than it found it. Work that lets other people become the story, so everyone goes home. They called me Black Widow. I called it doing my job. Some nights the quiet roared louder than rotors. Out there, silence meant cover sound discipline radios hushed to a whisper. At home, it was punishment tailored to fit the kind my father could wear for years without fraying. It filled the rooms we no longer shared and seeped under the door jambs of every conversation we didn't have. After my first deployment, I wrote him on paper. I said the water was colder than it looks on posters, that good men learn to laugh before bad nights, that my work mattered even when no one pinned it to a board. I tucked in a photo me at the pier, one hand on a pelican case, salt whitening the chain link. I signed with love and a return address. The letter came back unopened. Mom kept the line alive by herself. Sunday evenings, she'd call and ask small questions that let a big life through. Are you sleeping? Anything green on your plate? Did you find a chapel? She never asked about operations. I'm fine was a dialect we both spoke. When we hung up, I stood and breathed. I mailed him a photo the day I picked up Lieutenant. Bars under fluorescent lights never look like they do in movies, too pale, too honest. I wrote, "You taught me to stand straight." It helps. A month later, the same picture returned in a fresh envelope creased once across the middle. No note. Illness entered quietly. Biopsy, Mom said, like she was sounding it out for a spelling bee. My father informed me by email, 2 sentences correctly punctuated. I called from a stairwell in Bahrain where the heat clung like a wet shirt. Mom told me not to come yet. Do your job, she said. I'll do mine. When hospice called, I was already wheels up. Hill caught my eye across the aisle and didn't ask. The nurse spoke softly. Mom's hands were translucent. Blue was suddenly a color to fear. My father stood at the window, arms crossed. He nodded when I entered and returned to guarding the parking lot. I read to her because words were the first house we built together. Frost, then Mary Oliver, then whatever the visitor library offered. She drifted in and out like tide. When she woke clear, she pressed 2 fingers to my sleeve and whispered, "Keep flying." Not away, just up. She died before sunrise. The room changed. At the funeral, I spoke second because he spoke first. I kept it playing her car that smelled like lemons in winter, the way she graded with pencil in mercy, how she could name 5 birds by silhouette. When I glanced down, my father was stapling the program together over and over like paper could become armor by repetition. He never looked back. Back on base, I added a box to every pre-mission checklist. Who calls home if it goes sideways? We wrote names and carried numbers like talismans. Hill started leaving coffee on my desk without comment. The team knocked twice on the table before briefs. We made a habit of asking, "How's your air?" meaning inside, not outside. An old chief called it soft, then stopped after it saved a young guy. I tried phoning my father late one night when miles make the tongue braver. He picked up on the second ring and said, "Hello." I asked about gutters and weather and the neighbor's maple that had leaned dangerous for years. "Came down," he said. "Took out the fence." I said I was sorry. He said, "Check your tires before winter," and we hung up like we'd coordinated a delivery. Promotions arrived like seasons announced, inevitable, still startling. A rumor of my nickname leaked past the rooms I ate in. He never asked. On his birthday, I mailed him a book of national parks because once, when I was 7, he'd lifted me to a carved bear and said, "That's the real country." Inside I wrote, "We could go see one together." He sent a thank you card with his name typed under the closing as if he were signing orders. There's a fatigue that doesn't come from miles. It comes from rehearsing answers to questions you know won't be asked. I learned to keep the phone face down and the ringer off. I learned to hold a truth without anyone saluting it. The teams knocked when it mattered. My father's doors swung only for weather. A mutual friend from their church finally broke our stalemate. She wrote in looping cursive, "He keeps your picture in his study. He doesn't talk about it." I read the sentence until it dulled. Care can look like custody. When the Navy pinned a medal on me for something that belonged to a dozen hands, I sent him the program in block letters just how he liked addresses. No response. A month later came a different envelope. "They're making you a symbol," in his small, precise script. 5 words that felt like a door closing. Labels are tidy until you live under them. A symbol doesn't sit with a grieving chief at 0300. A symbol doesn't memorize families. I kept showing up with a pencil sharp and a map open, listening for the hum in the lines. I stopped needing him to hear it. I wrote one last time before the night in the hall. "I'm coming through town for a reunion," I said. "There's a seat if you want it." He didn't reply. The invitation felt like placing a glass of water by a sleeping man and walking out not expecting to find it empty or full, just not wanting him to wake thirsty. Silence taught me a paradox the teams had only hinted at. You can love someone you don't let steer. You can respect the parts that built you without living under their roof. I stopped knocking on a door that opened only to drafts. I set the latch on my side. I waited for the work. It never makes you wait long. The first time I realized the teams were my family, we were ankle-deep in gray water, under a sky the color of scraped metal. A storm had come in crooked wind, pushing the channel sideways, radios gurgling with salt. We were staged to launch a small package for a recovery operation that would never make the paper. Nothing cinematic, no hero shots, no swelling music, just men checking straps with fingers that knew how to count heartbreak, and me at a folding table with a grease pencil and a plan I could run in my sleep. Widow Hill said he never called me ma'am when it was just us. "You want a second set of eyes." "I want your doubt," I said, sliding him the board. "If it holds up to that, it holds." He looked, grunted, then tapped a box I'd drawn in the corner. "You put the soft fail here." "Always put the soft fail where you can see it," I said. "Saves you from the hard one." He nodded, satisfied the way older brothers nod when the younger one finally lifts what he couldn't last summer. We moved. The operation bent once, and then behaved. Not because luck grew generous, but because we had rehearsed the folds. Back at the pier, soaked and quiet, a young SEAL I'd been watching, a good kid with a habit of aiming his jaw at the floor, stopped beside my table. "You knew the second pump was dying," he said. "I knew it," I answered. "That's the only kind of knowing that keeps people." He chewed that, then said, almost shy, "Thanks for making a plan I could fit inside." It was the best compliment I'd ever been given. Men who trusted maps more than speeches had decided mine could carry them. That's how a family is built in our world, one night of proof at a time. Between rotations, I kept rewriting the training modules the way you update a will. Not because you're eager to use it, but because you love what it protects. We added stress inoculation that wasn't about breaking bodies. It was about teaching a mind to recognize its own weather. I wrote a checklist called After What to Do. Not in the hour after contact, but in the week after the adrenaline leaves and the silence arrives. We piloted it with 3 platoons. Near misses dropped. Bad surprises shrank. The old guard teased and then started using the forms when no one watched. Widow's Church, Torres called it half joking, half grateful. Everybody gets out with their shoes. We made rituals that looked small, knock twice on the table before wheels up, ask how's your air in the chow line and wait for the answer. Make the new guys brief the boring parts so they learn boredom keeps you alive. When a chief's marriage cracked, we found him a counselor who knew how to sit with men who traded sleep for safety. When a kid's mother got sick, the platoon pretended it was logistics and arranged the flights. One afternoon in the cage, I watched a group of candidates work a knot they'd pretend wasn't choking them. Sweat turned their shirts into maps. An instructor barked. I stepped in only to ask a question. "What's your plan when the plan's wrong?" Blank stares at first, then one spoke. "We look for the pattern under the pattern." I smiled. "That's a life skill, not just a job skill. Keep it." Reputation is a slow river. You notice it only when it's carved the bank. Directors from the other side of the house, intel logistics, even a doc with hands steady enough to stitch a hummingbird started drifting by my little room with questions. I printed fewer glossy slides and more checklists. I learned to translate between men who built doors and men who'd kick them. The nickname, which I still never used for myself, traveled like a postcard with no return address. A visiting captain introduced me at a briefing as the one who hears the web hum. I resisted the urge to roll my eyes. It wasn't humming I heard, it was men. Their pauses, their jokes too loud, the way hands fumbled a strap when thoughts were at home in rooms they feared. You learn to listen to what a body says when the mouth is busy elsewhere. One winter, the ocean turned mean and took a diver who didn't deserve it. We stood in dress blues on a cold parade deck while the wind stabbed and a bell tolled a count too small for the size of the loss. Afterward, a kid, the age I would have been if the world were kinder, stood in front of me and tried to ask how to bear it. "You don't," I said softly. "You carry it. There's a difference." He nodded, eyes bright, like a man filing away a truth he didn't want but would need. Loyalty returned in currencies that lasted longer than medals. Hill named his second daughter Avery because he said the name could run. Torres, who had once sneered at my mental health check-ins, now ran them with a voice you could sit on. At Christmas, my desk filled with cards from people who didn't write cards. "Ma'am, one scribbled your web kept me breathing this year." On leave again, I visited a base where the chapel had more scuffs on its pews than the gym had on its floor. A chaplain I trusted said, "You know you're ministering." I laughed. "I'm managing risk." He tilted his head. Same job, different incense. I tried dating a few civilians, nice men who wanted me safe. They talked about weekends like a promise. I talked about Tuesday night flights like weather. Most of them looked at my hands and saw steel where I wanted them to see steadiness. It turned out the only people who didn't ask me to be smaller were the ones who understood why space is something you make not take. Love would find me later, and it would not ask me to lie about the weight. The kid with the jaw, tilt his name, was Remy, turned into a man in front of me, the way sun turns frost into a road. He'd be the one years later to see me in a crowded hall and lose his voice memory and gratitude colliding behind his eyes. But before he could know that he had to learn a different lesson, how to step into a room and make everyone else taller. We practiced. I made him brief, then fail, then fix it. "You're not a gun with legs," I told him. "You're a human with a brain that makes it home." On a hot spring afternoon that smelled like wet canvas, and CLP Command invited me to talk about best practices, I brought one slide, "Respect is a logistics problem." It got a laugh and then a hush. I told them that when you plan for dignity, you prevent a dozen kinds of ruin. "Write it down," I said. "Then hold it when the weather turns." Word pushed out beyond our circle. A colonel I didn't know sent a note, "I hear you make rooms safer." I pinned it on the wall with a strip of blue tape and forgot to be humble for a minute. Then the day demanded humility again, and I gave it. Back home, my father's silence kept its posture. He never asked, never answered what wasn't yes or no. The town kept his coffee hot. Men in ball caps still thanked him for service at the post office, and he nodded like a man receiving mail he didn't remember ordering. It wasn't anger I felt anymore. It was distance, with a shape I could measure and walk around. If the teams were my family, it was because we'd chosen to be accountable to each other's lives. Blood can be an accident. Duty is not. The men knocked twice, and I knocked back, and we built a house out of habits no storm could rip clean. That house would matter on the night when a community hall filled with people who knew my father's voice better than my own would pivot all at once on a name spoken like a prayer and a warning. Family isn't who can hurt you most. It's who refuses to. The hall breathed like a single lung after the question landed. "Are you?" The Black Widow of the SEALs. Remy said it barely above a whisper, but rooms like that carry what they want. Conversations thinned into threads, then snapped. A fork somewhere ticked against a plate and went still. The ceiling fans kept their slow rotation as if the air hadn't changed its mind. My father's hand was still on Remy's shoulder, fingers spread with the familiarity of men who understand rank and muscle. He looked from the young man to me and back again. Comprehension hunting for a foothold. The proud set of his jaw faltered, just a tremor, a hairline crack. Anyone else would have called it the light. Remy swallowed. I saw the tell-two beats high in his throat. He straightened shoulders, squaring to something he hadn't expected to salute tonight. "Ma'am?" he said, voice steadier, louder. So there'd be no mistaking it now. "Permission to breathe," I said softly. "Then talk." He took a breath like a man surfacing. "You built the plan at Alcara," he said. "You spun the net when the roots went bad. He stopped, recalibrated. "We got home because you heard it before we did." A murmur rolled the length of the room. The old VFW men in khakis shifted expressions, rearranging. The women who had been fanning themselves lowered paper programs. A boy of 12 looked at me like I'd stepped out of a story he'd wanted to believe. My father released Remy's shoulder as if it had grown hot. "What is this?" He asked the question aimed at the room, so he wouldn't have to aim it at me. He chuckled once for show. "Some nickname my daughter files papers. She doesn't." Sir Remy said. "Respect and steal both. With respect, she doesn't file." He didn't finish the sentence because he didn't need to. The men who have walked back into fluorescent light carrying pieces they didn't count on know how to leave blanks intact. I moved then, not much half a step, that put me where I could see the doors and the old flag by the stage and the reflection of us all in the glass of the trophy case. "It's just a name," I said. "Names are lighter than work." A veteran near the coffee urn cleared his throat. Which teams, he asked, though the answer didn't matter. "Habit." "Enough," Remy said, eyes still on me. "Long enough to teach us to listen for the hum." The hum. The word carried. A man in the back, who had stood taller when my father spoke now, leaned forward, elbows on knees. A younger woman, hair in a bun jaw, set the way people wear it when they've had to be their own witness, nodded once, like the room had finally introduced me properly. Dad tried for humor. "Well," he said, palms out, "I'm sure she's very good at her spreadsheets." It was the kind of line that wins small laughter in rooms that owe you deference. None came. Not this time. A cousin I barely knew, but who had my mother's eyebrows, spoke up, tentative but clear. "Uncle Frank, I think maybe you don't know everything she is." Silence can wound. It can heal, too. The pause that followed wasn't empty. It was full of people recalculating moving chairs in their heads. People are quick studies when the math is respect. Remy found his voice again. "Ma'am?" He said, "I owe you, and I've never said it out loud. We were stacked wrong one night, and you—" His eyes glistened hard, then cleared. "You fixed the angle. I still send my mother a card in May because you did." I didn't want this to turn into a testimony. The work doesn't belong to one throat. Team effort, I said. Always. He shook his head just enough to disagree without insubordination. Teams don't cohere by accident. At a side table, the MC, Mrs. Dwyer, the elementary school receptionist, who had once bandaged 1,000 playground knees, lifted the microphone slowly, then set it down. She understood when to let a room find its own gravity. Dad crossed his arms, that old fortress pose. "I know the difference between a story and a life," he said. And for a second, I saw him, younger boots muddied a river he didn't want to cross, still insisting. "Don't sell me a legend." "I'm not selling you anything," I said. "I'm standing where you can see me." The words were simple enough that they felt like furniture. The room made room for them. A man in a ball cap, Vietnam vet, I'd seen him fold a flag with hands that didn't shake, rose. Halfway, then all the way. He didn't salute. He placed his hand over his heart. Something ancient moved along the tables like wind through wheat. Another man stood. A woman who'd worn the uniform in a different war stood. Remy straightened, as if coming to attention might hold the ceiling square. No one called Admiral on deck. That belonged to other days. But the effect rhymed bodies, remembering they know how to rise when honor demands knees to unlock. Dad's eyes flashed annoyance, then calculation. Then was it fear? Not of me, of the revision. The past is a jealous scripture. It hates edits. He looked smaller inside his jacket. I let the silence sit where it needed to. I didn't list operations. I didn't rescue the night with anecdotes. I have never seen a story saved by louder. Instead, I told one true thing offered like a coin on a counter. Respect isn't inherited, I said. It's earned. Sometimes in rooms where no one can see. Sometimes right here. A chair scraped. The boy who'd been measuring me with awe whispered to his dad, "She's really real." His father squeezed his shoulder. "Looks that way," he said. Mrs. Dwyer tried the microphone again. It squealed and then minded. Why don't we take a minute?" she said, the diplomat. This town deserved. Coffee's hot. Cake's on the table. And if anyone wants to share a word for those serving, we can do that after. Movement broke the spell and blessed it. People migrated toward coffee, not to drink, but to recalibrate. Heads turned toward me, some with curiosity, some with apology, some with the gentle relief of puzzles solved. Men I had mowed lawns beside at 14 looked at me like I had grown a second spine and found it suited. Remy came closer. We didn't hug. This wasn't that room. He stood at a distance that said, "I know the rules," and lowered his voice. "I didn't mean to make it a scene," he said. "You didn't," I answered. "You made it honest." He nodded, jaw locking and unlocking emotions, learning new boots. "He didn't know," he said, glancing at my father. "He didn't want to," I said. "There's a difference." Dad hovered near the stagehands, clasped behind his back like a man inspecting a field he'd sown for rocks. People gave him space, respect for what he had been, wrestled with irritation at what he was being. He stared at the flag and didn't salute. I poured coffee I didn't want and found myself surrounded by small talk that was really big talk. "We're proud of you, and did you know our Tina joined the Air Force and my brother served? He would have liked you." I accepted each sentence the way you accept medals. "You'll never display gently because the giver needs the ceremony more than you do." When I turned back, Dad was closer. Not close. Closer. He studied my face with a concentration that used to precede a lecture on discipline. "If any of this is true," he said, each word weighed, "why didn't you tell me?" "Because you never asked," I said. Then kinder, "because I couldn't." He considered that with the fairness he reserved for geometry and weather. His mouth tightened, then softened. "I wanted." He stopped. I expected he stopped again, the sentence a bridge with missing planks. Finally, I didn't know the language. There it was, the first honest thing between us in years. Not absolution, a foothold. "You don't have to speak it," I said. "You just have to stop correcting my accent." A laugh broke from someone behind us, not unkind. Dad didn't smile, but his shoulders dropped a quarter inch, and for the first time that night, he wasn't performing a man he needed to be. He was just a man out of date and out of breath, trying to read a map that had acquired new roads while he slept. Remy lifted his cup toward me, small salute, then faded back into the cluster of men who know how to be silent without being absent. Around us, the room reset to ordinary, the ice clink of tea, the scrape of chairs, the clatter of forks. But nothing had returned to its old measurement. The scale had tilted gently, permanently. Later, someone would say, "Do you remember the night Frank's line fell flat?" Someone else would say, "Do you remember the kid who trembled?" And a third would say, with the certainty of someone who saw the web after it was pointed out, "Do you remember how we all stood just a little?" I do. I remember the exact sound the floor made when respect put its weight down. The town emptied into night the way it always does, slowly, like a hymn thinning into echoes. After the hall, I drove the long way past the high school bleachers, the diner that never changed its pie, the hardware store that still displayed a flag in the window, big enough to shade a truck. I let the engine idle by the river where the water wore the moon like a bruise. I hadn't meant to stay, but leaving without checking my interior felt like bad planning. You don't step off a Target building without looking at your team. You don't close a door on a night like that without looking at yourself. My phone buzzed once, a text from an unknown number, then a second from a familiar one. "Remy, first ma'am, didn't want to make a mess. Just wanted to hand back what you handed me." I typed back, "You did fine." We all got home. Then the second message. Not words, an image. A photo taken from the far end of the hall, slightly tilted. People standing. My father in the foreground, not standing, but not as straight as before either. As if the air had changed density and his body didn't quite know how to live in it yet. I slept at the base guest quarters that night because history can crowd a house. In the morning, I ran the perimeter road until my ribs found their rhythm. Movement is a form of forgiveness you can give yourself without anyone's permission. When I finished, sweat stung my eyes and washed something else with it. By noon, I was sitting on the porch steps of my father's house, palms flat on the paint that needed a new coat. He opened the door with his mouth already forming a sentence, then stopped. He looked older on his own threshold than he had under the fluorescent lights men shrink differently under different skies. For a heartbeat, he seemed surprised that I had the address. Then he stepped back to let me in. "Coffee?" he asked, defaulting to ritual. "Yes," I said, defaulting to mercy. We took our old places at the kitchen table that had weathered our wars. He kept his hands around the mug like it was field heat. I kept mine on the table so he could see they were empty. "I didn't know," he said finally. 4 words that weigh more than an apology if you're careful with them. "I didn't tell you," I countered, then added what mattered. "I couldn't, and you didn't ask." He considered that, and the fairness that had once made him a good junior officer reappeared around the eyes. "I didn't ask." He repeated, not defensively, just recording a fact. "I wanted." He inhaled, then exhaled the past. "I expected a son to carry a name. That was foolish and unkind." I didn't rush in to absolve. We were both too old for quick repairs. "Names get heavy," I said. I picked up a different kind of weight. He nodded slow. "They called you." He trailed off, embarrassed by the romance of it. "A nickname is just a handle," I said. "What matters is what you lift with it." He stared at a spot on the table where the varnish had bubbled years ago when I'd set a pot down too hot. He'd lectured me for an hour. Now he reached out and touched the blemish like it was a map legend. "Did you ever want me there?" he asked. "Only if you could stand," I said. "Not for me, for yourself." We talked not about missions or medals, but about the air inside old men, about loss that arrives first as silence and then as furniture you keep bumping into at night. I told him Mom's last words to me because they belonged to both of us. "Keep flying. Not away, just up." He looked away long enough that the clock over the sink marked 3 full minutes. When he turned back, his voice had changed key. "If I came to something." He made a general gesture that meant anything, with chairs facing forward. "Would there be a seat?" "There's always a seat," I said. "You choose where to put your hands." His gaze moved to the doorway and stayed there. I realized he was seeing himself walk through it not as a commander, but as a penitent. The muscles for that motion had atrophied. He would have to build them like any rookie. I didn't wait for him to say a braver sentence. The plan was simple. Leave without slamming, return without requirement. I stood, rinsed my mug, set it upside down to dry. At the threshold, he cleared his throat. "Proud," he said, 1 word naked. Then he added quieter, as if he didn't want to startle the truth, even when I didn't know how. I didn't cry. I nodded. "Do the knowing now," I said, and stepped into the bright. Back on base, I answered emails that had gathered while the night did its rearranging. A chaplain wrote to say the town was talking with its kinder voice today. A mother I'd met once at a pinning ceremony wrote, "My boy said you make rooms taller. Thank you for letting him be tall." I typed back. He stood himself. I just moved the chairs. Command called curious in the way bureaucracies get when reputation and metrics intersect. Would I brief a new working group on training reforms? And the human factors we pretend are optional? I said yes because men I loved were breathing in rooms that might someday be safer if I kept telling the truth. Respect, I reminded them, is a logistics problem. Plan for it and watch what doesn't break. Letters followed the briefing, some written in block capitals, some in the shaky script of men who had outlived their squad. A young officer asked if I had advice for leading when a room resents your pronouns. I told her, show your math and share your credit. Knock twice before you enter any soul. She wrote back that she'd printed it and taped it inside her locker, next to a picture of her mother holding a wrench. Weeks later, an envelope arrived with my father's precise hand on it. Inside a clipping from the local paper, no photo, just a paragraph about the reunion, and a line that said, The community stood to honor service. Beneath it, he had written, "I should have stood sooner." 5 words oddly familiar. I pinned them beside a map of a county that didn't need mapping and let them make the room a little different. Remy visited once, on his way through to a school he didn't think he deserved to teach at. He brought his mother's pecan pie and a modest discomfort with my office. "Too tidy," he said, smiling. "You'd hate my garage." We sat on crates because chairs lie to you about power. He asked if he'd done right in the hall. "You told the truth," I said. "Truth stands up fine without a witness, but some nights it appreciates the company." When he left, he knocked twice on my door jamb like a man borrowing luck he meant to return. The night before I headed back east, I stopped at Mom's grave. The grass had grown back even where our grief had scuffed it. I pressed my palm to the stone because some words require skin to travel. "We're learning," I said aloud to the low air. Slow, but in the right direction. The wind moved through the oaks with the patience of old women quilting. I took it as an answer. In the end, revenge didn't feel like spectacle. It felt like stillness, like choosing not to twist the knife when history hands it to you, like standing so straight other people remember their own spines and find them sufficient. The room had stood. My father hadn't then, couldn't then, maybe would. That was enough beginning for one life. People ask what the nickname means. I tell them it's just a handle. What matters is what you lift with it. Team's truth, the corner of a room that won't get light unless someone pulls the curtain. If you were in that hall, you would remember the sound that oak floor made when respect put its weight down. I remember, and when the nights get long, I let that sound play again. It's better than applause. It's the sound of a community editing itself toward courage. Blood didn't salute that night. Honor did. And it still does, if we let it. If this story sat with you, if it reminded you of someone who stood for you when others didn't, or of a room that changed because a truth finally spoke, take a breath with me. Share your moment below so someone else can borrow your courage. And if you want more stories that carry weight without shouting about service, mercy, and standing tall, stick around, subscribe, and bring a friend who needs the reminder. We rise straighter when we rise together.